Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. My name is Julian Richards. I am the managing editor at Open Democracy. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a global media outlet, and our mission is to challenge power and inspire change wherever we can do so. Thanks to you all for joining us, and thank you particularly to those of you who've submitted questions in advance. We want as many of you want you to be as involved in this discussion as possible, and so we're going to use as many of your questions or address as many of your questions as we can during the conversation. If you're joining us on Zoom and you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you can just click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and say what you'd like to say there. Those questions will be fed to the chair, who will attempt to address as many of them as possible. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can do the same thing using the comments on Facebook. We'll be watching those too. Please forgive anything that goes wrong. This is a fairly low-tech event. It's possible that children, pets, spouses, drilling noises, or anything else, or technical hitches may intervene. Please bear with us if that happens. All that's remained for me to say is that this event was inspired by an article that Chantal Mouffe wrote for Open Democracy recently, titled "Why Populist Left Should Rally Around a Green Democratic Transformation." That article I'm about to put in the chat for you if you want to have a look. But with that, I'm going to hand over to Walid Houri, who is going to introduce the rest of the panel and chair the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. Welcome to everyone joining us from across the world. And of course, thank you for the three speakers. We are very excited to have such a great panel. My name is Walid Houri. I'm the partnerships editor at Open Democracy and lead editor of the North Africa West Asia section. A few weeks ago, on one of our partnership pages called Rethinking Populism, we published Chantal Mouffe's insightful article that Julian just mentioned and put in the chat, which is the inspiration of today's debate and at the heart of the question that we're asking. So can there be a green populist project on the left? Rethinking Populism is the product of a partnership between Open Democracy and Lund University, Istanbul Bilgi University, the University of Helsinki, and the Academy of Finland's Mainstreaming Populism Consortium. The page brings together voices to contribute to politically urgent debates about how to develop effective and progressive political strategies. And it is edited by Spiros Sophos, who is with us today. You can check out some of the great work that we published already following the link that I will put in the chat in a second. But before we start, I have the pleasure to introduce our three speakers. Chantal Mouffe is Emeritus Professor of Political Theory at the University of Westminster in London. Her most recent books are Agonistics, Thinking the World Politically, Podemos, In the Name of the People with Inigo Errejón, and For a Left Populism. Joining us also is sociologist and political theorist Paolo Gerbaudo. He's the director of the Center for Digital Culture at King's College London and author of Tweets and Streets, Social Media and Contemporary Activism, The Mask and the Flag, Populism and Global Protest, and the Digital Party, Political Organization and Online Democracy. His forthcoming book, The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and Pandemic, will be out in September 2021 and published by Verso. And finally, Spiros Sophos, researcher and research coordinator at the Center of Middle East Studies at Lund University, and he serves on the editorial committee of the Journal of Contemporary European Studies. His work focuses on political identities and collective action and the construction and articulation of the popular through politics. His publications include Nation and Identity in Contemporary Europe, Tormented by History, and Islam in Europe, Public Spaces and Civic Networks. Thank you all again for joining. And I would like to start off by inviting Chantal to tell us more about why a populist left should rally around a green democratic transformation. So please, Chantal. You're still muted. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I don't know exactly where everybody is. Well, thank you very much to Open Democracy for having published my piece and also for having organized the discussion. Well, I'm going to just begin by a very short point of precision about what I understand by left populism, because, you know, populism means many different things to many different people, and I think it's very important that it's clear what I'm talking about. For me, first, populism is a strategy of construction of the political frontier. That is a strategy of the construction between the us and the them. For me, this is absolutely central to politics. Not everybody agree on that, but for me, that is they found a dissociative view, and politics is a both, you know, conflict, antagonism, distinction, us and the populism is a strategy of construction of the political frontier. For instance, it's not the only one. There is a Marxist construction of the political frontier, but it is between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The populist form of construction is different. It's between the people and the, you know, the oppressed people and the people who oppress them, the people and the establishment. I mean, it's different cases, but basically it's a question of, let's call it people oligarchy, people establishment. Here I also want to insist on some other important theoretical point, is that when we speak of people establishment, we are not speaking of sociological categories. You know, for instance, the people being there, and they are always political construction. The people is not a sociological category, is the discursive construction, political construction. So it can be constructed in many different ways. And this is where the difference exists between what is called right-wing populism and left-wing populism, in the way in which they define the people differently. For instance, for right-wing populism, the immigrants are not part of the people, while for left-wing populism, the immigrants are part of the people. So you can see it's very important, this distinction. Or we could say more generally that right-wing populism tend to have resort to democracy, but to restrict democracy, while left-wing populism aim is to extend, expand, radicalize democracy. Okay, so this is the first point. So the article is in fact, the question that I'm posing is, how should we envisage a left-wing populist strategy in the present conjuncture? The present conjuncture being a conjuncture of ecological, social, and economic crisis. You know, and of course, I'm here referring of the situation, the link with the coronavirus crisis. So what should be a left populist strategy in these circumstances? Well, let's examine first, you know, what is this conjuncture? And I distinguish between different possible scenarios, strategies already in place during this conjuncture. First, of course, we've got the strategy of neoliberals. Neoliberals are trying to defend themselves because they are, of course, a crisis of neoliberalism, but they are trying, in fact, to use this situation in order to renew themselves, in a sense. And what we are seeing is the development of some form of state neoliberalism. Neoliberals are really, you know, they recourse to the state, to use the state in order to reassert the predominance of capital. But of course, they are doing that mainly through some very authoritarian measure. You know, so there is a real tendency of reinforce authoritarianism. And also another important aspect of the strategy of neoliberalism is to the use of what Evgeny Morozov called the technical solutionism. You know, the idea of the Silicon Valley, that let's have apps and the digital things, we are going to resolve all the problems. I mean, as I say in the article, basically, this is a new version of the third way idea that there is no, the post-democratic conception, that there is no difference between left and right, no antagonism, and no, it's more envisaged in technological way. So this clearly is an authoritarian solution to the crisis. Then we've got another scenario, which is the scenario of right-wing populism. Well, right-wing populism also presents an authoritarian solution, but different, of course. They are accusing neoliberals of being responsible for the crisis. They say the crisis, in fact, is a consequence of neoliberal globalization, of the fact that they've abandoned the idea of sovereignty, they defend free trade, and all that is what is, took us to the situation where we are today. Of course, so what they are saying is that we need to reinstore sovereignty, but of course, sovereignty understood, in a very nationalistic way. And again, as I'm saying, it's definitively a solution that is going to make societies even more authoritarian. So what should be the left populist strategy in this context? Well, I think that definitively what is the main objective is we need to resist this tendency towards authoritarianism. And it needs to be a strategy which is going to expand democracy. First to recover democracy that has already been, abandoned through the post-democratic policies of neoliberalism, recover it and extend it. Okay, but ocean cannot be done. And this is, of course, what I examine in the article. There are 2 points which I think are really important on which I want to insist. Which on one, protection and the ecological crisis. Because I think that it's very important when you are going to envisage, how can we have a strategy which is going to resist the move towards authoritarianism, to realize that, in the circumstances of the pandemic, there is a strong desire for protection that we find in the people. Here I make reference to Polanyi and the fact that he say when their society is, in situation in which there is big transformation, people feel they need to be protected. And in fact, we can see that both the neoliberal and the right-wing populism, in a sense, they address that. Of course, they address it in a way that, don't worry, we are going to have some technological solution. I'm sorry. And of course, the strategy of right-wing populism is to develop some kind of authoritarian nationalism, some kind of what I call an immunitary type of nationalism. So what I'm arguing is that it's very important for the left to recognize this need for protection. Because I think that in general, it's not something that the left is good at. They see that something which is not very progressive, the need for protection. I think that is crucial to recognize that, because if they don't address the question of the need of protection, they are not going to be able to resist the move towards authoritarianism. But of course, the question is that this need for protection need to be addressed in a way which is in fact going to orientate this need in a democratic direction, to find ways to articulate this need for protection with democratic values, with the fact that we are going to propose a series of measures which are going to empower people. Let's say, instead of having people retreating, in some kind of, as I was saying, immunitary form of nationalism, or accepting, passively the fact to have technological solution. We need to find policies which are going to empower people. And I think that's if we want to be able to resist the move to authoritarianism, this is something which is really crucial. And of course, the question is that the left need obviously also to address the question of the ecological crisis, because we are really in a situation of ecological emergency. climate emergency. So need to organize this project around a way in which we are going to articulate protection with, a solution, or solution, so maybe as a big no, but a way of to deal with the ecological crisis. And that's the third point, which is important in my argument. This need to be done in a way which is going to mobilize affects towards a project in which people could find a way in which a better kind of society is proposed to them. We need that's something which is very crucial to my work, the way in which, in order to create a more political mobilization, it's not enough to have good policies. I think the left too often believe, okay, we've got the good policies, so the people are going, no. As Spinoza say, ideas only have force when they meet affects. It's not enough to have good policies and good ideas. You need to have affect. You need to mobilize affect. You need to be able to reach people in the things, the way they feel, the thing that they want. So this is absolutely crucial for me. And the proposal I'm making in this article is that, in fact, it's the way in which I see the possibility of resisting authoritarianism and addressing the question of protection and the ecological crisis is to envisage this ecological transition in terms of what I call a green democratic transition. That is a project that articulates all the necessary ecological measure, for instance, that the central question of the decarbonization of the economy, but articulating that with the defense of social justice, the struggle against inequalities, and different kind of inequalities. I think things which have got a socioeconomic one, but also, for instance, everything that's got to do with feminism, anti-racism. So need to articulate a series of demand around a project of transformation of society, dealing with the question of ecological demands, in articulating all that. In fact, it is basically the project of what is called a green New Deal, Green New Deal. This is why do I propose to call that a green democratic transition? That's where the question of affects for me is really important, because I think that it is important to realize that the New Deal is not if it's going to really manage to create a popular movement, is because it is able to mobilize affects, to really create in people, suscitate enthusiasm, to make them realize that this kind of project is going to bring them a better society. So in fact, the green democratic transformation, it's something which deal with the protection of society, the protection of the condition of the reproduction of society, but in a way in which people feel empowered. And I think here we need to understand what move people to act. For instance, that's a thesis that we already developed with Ernesto Laclau in Hegemony Socialist Strategy. What have been the moving force of different democratic advances, is the democratic imaginary. The fact that idea of liberty and equality for all. I mean, all the different social struggle have been moved, by this idea. People were fighting in order to create a society in which liberty and equality for all will be realized. I think that we should envisage this green democratic transformation of a new step in this process of radicalization of democracy. I think that's the way in which we can really mobilize common affect to create a people that will be composed precisely of the articulation of all those democratic demands, the struggle against form of oppression, the question of discrimination, the exploitation, around the idea we are going to move a step further in the democratic revolution. And this is the question of the green democratic transition. I really believe that, I realize it's not easy to do, but I think that it is how we should envisage from the part of the left, the way to deal with the actual social, ecological, and economic crisis.
Thank you, Chantal. I believe there would be many things to get back to hear your questions. And I would like to remind our viewers that that they can add their questions at any time in the chat box. I want to now move to Paolo. And Paolo, you've written a lot about populism yourself. So could you let us know, like, what is your take on this?
Yes, I'd like to follow on the path that has been broken by Chantal. As I mean, the question of protection is really crucial to this new book, The Great Recoil, whose idea is that indeed protection has become a sort of master signifier of the post-neoliberal era. I think this is the hypothesis we need to work with. An era where the general meta-ideological coordinates are moving away from neoliberalism because of the manifest inability of neoliberalism to deal with a situation in which we have zero interest rates, in which we have 0% inflation, we are in a deflation if it wasn't for massive monetary injections, and rising unemployment. It is a bit like the 70s for Keynesian economics. That's the same situation now for neoliberal economists. Or if you want to use another metaphor, it's like the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall was for communists. I mean, it is a moment of trauma for the neoliberal center, because the rules and the rules of the game and the analytical grid they use for 40 years of neoliberal hegemony are not working anymore. They don't reflect what is happening in reality. And what is happening in reality is a situation where we have a number of converging systemic crises. There's the idea of the book title, The Great Recoil, where in a way our actions are recoiling back against us. I mean, global capitalism is recoiling again, back against itself. So we have this impression that things are turning backward and inward, and therefore are raising very basic and essential questions that have to do with the constitution and the reproduction of political communities that we, in a way, overlooked during the neoliberal era. The exopolitics of the neoliberal era preoccupy with the outside, as seen in the obsession with outsourcing, offshoring, externalization, with opening up the space, opening up social units, is now substituted by an endopolitics, which is more concerned with restoring the basic conditions of functioning of political communities. And this is seen in the emergence of new signifiers, sovereignty, that is not just national sovereignty, also social movements use the idea of sovereignty as an idea of recuperation of territorial control over resources and over decisions. It is seen in the language of control, that in a way is the means of sovereignty. And it is seen in the language of protection, that is in a way the end of sovereignty. The state, the power of the state, national sovereignty and popular sovereignty have as their ultimate aim protection. And this is seen in the history of political philosophy. I mean, politicians, the elite political class in Plato's Republic was called the guardians. And from the word phulasso in ancient Greek, which means precisely to protect. And Plato in the Republic goes on and on saying that the guardians and their commanders need to be protective of the city, and that the function of the city is protecting its citizens. A comment echoed famously by Hobbes when he said that protection is the very essence of politics, and that protection is the necessary condition for obedience. citizens are only obliged to obey authority as long as they are protected. Right? This is a theme that really runs through political philosophy, also in Machiavelli, obviously we see that, right? The idea of constructing dikes, dams and canals to stem the flow of water in order to protect society against unexpected events, to plan ahead. I mean, or you can think about Cicero, like the idea that the health of the people is the supreme law. So these are, in a way, concepts that were very familiar to ancient philosophers and to early modern philosophers, but in a way we have overlooked because we had the luxury to think about other things. And now we face existential threats that really raise questions about the sustainability of the model of civilization that we have been living in. I mean, there was at the beginning of the lockdown in Spain, a very interesting speech by Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, where he said that while for a long time we always thought about how we could improve our condition, now we are struggling to maintain what we already have. And I think that this is a quite interesting framework, because indeed, what is really worrying about the climate crisis, and not just about the coronavirus crisis, is that they seem to put in question the very basic conditions, the very essentials that we took for granted, and that instead we thought that we could push beyond in a politics of aspiration, right? There was the typical politics of neoliberalism. Now that politics of aspiration and the aspirational middle class as a sort of master target for political appeals is leaving the way to another type of politics, perhaps what we could call a politics of desperation, a politics of status anxiety, where people's major worry is to guarantee the minimum conditions that they have, obviously to improve society, to fight for equality, but first and foremost to maintain the things they prize in society, including public services. I think people have become so well aware in recent years, I'd say during the Great Recession for a start, and then more so during the coronavirus crisis, of how important and underestimated public services starting from public health are. Therefore, a politics of protection that focuses on the public services that act as fundamental social support system that are responsible for guaranteeing minimum conditions of existence and facilitating social reproduction are central to a politics of protection. And that is why people have been seeing a recuperation of public health and public services as important in what is called also a politics of care, which I think is a term that is very strongly related to protection as an act of fostering, of maintaining, of nurturing a community and nurturing society. But in this new landscape, in this post-neoliberal horizon that is now emerging, which is to a great extent a neo-statist horizon, right? In a sense that the new consensus is emerging on both the left and the right, that perhaps we need the state, we need some state interventionism. There are very different ways of looking at the role of the state and looking at the politics of protection. To put it in very simple terms that I develop in the book, on the right, we have fundamentally a proprietarian protectionism. The most important ideological rupture of the new right, of the nationalist populist right, vis-a-vis the neoliberal right, has been chipping away at some of the tenets of the neoliberal project, not at all of them, in a very selective way. And the main one was criticism of global trade. Right? For the very first time, we have now mainstream politicians of the right, politicians in government of the right, who are saying that global trade is not a good thing. And obviously, the most important thing that Trump did during his first mandate, hoping there is not a second one, was precisely to launch a trade war with China, which was a major change in terms of our imaginary. But ultimately, that politics of protection on the right is not aimed at improving social conditions in each country or at being accompanied by change in industrial policy in order to make countries more self-reliant, more diversified in their economic system, more just, more fair, more sustainable. It's simply there to defend national champions and to defend the existing system of property relations in a situation in which international competition has become fierce, and therefore, as at any time when international competition becomes fierce, hegemonic capitalist countries want to protect their national champions, fundamentally they're national capitalists. On the left, the politics of protection that is instead emerging is what could be described as a social protectivism. So protectivism in order not to use the term protectionism, which is mostly strongly associated with trade protectionism. Indeed, there is also an element of trade protectionism on the left, which is not new. I mean, you can go back to Keynes, you can go back to Calder, and you could see that already back then, there was a strong protectionist emphasis, an idea that you should have some trade tariffs, not in order to pursue an autarkic strategy, but in order to introduce some frictions that would have lessened the risk of social dumping and environmental dumping. And for example, you have Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who has been talking about the solidarity protectionism, which basically proposes to introduce tariffs, but more so non-tariff measures, regulations, certifications, in order to ensure that global trade is really a force for good, which it can be, right? But it can be only if it is radically transformed from the present situation. But besides that, obviously protectivism hints at other forms of protection that are fundamental to the present condition. Indeed, as Chantal was already saying, climate change is a major ecological threat that calls for all sorts of forms of protection, not just mitigation of climate change, but also what is called climate adaptation, which includes, for example, beach nourishment, the creation of coastal dunes, the creation of coastal protections against rising sea levels, the reinforcement of infrastructures, the defense of buildings, the defense of the territory, of the land, in order to avoid floods and all such things, which are in a way all forms of protection. They are ways to protect the territory and fundamentally to protect the human habitat, which is, I think, fundamental to the question of inhabitation, that to follow this Polanyian kind of thread is now crucial over improvement. I mean, people need to be reassured, if the left is to win over the right in this new post-neoliberal horizon, that the left is capable of protecting people, that it is able to respond to the fears that have become dominant over desires in this era, directing them towards goals of social fairness, social justice, and ecological sustainability.
Thank you, Paolo. I think also we'll come back to a lot of these points that you raised. And before that, I would like to invite Spiros to hear what he has to say about the possibility of having such a green left populist movement. Spiros, what's your take on this?
Thank you very much. And thank you both, Chantal and Paolo, for the very interesting discussion so far. I will, what I will say will be slightly, will have a slightly different emphasis, but it will revolve around the issues that, of course, have been raised in the very interesting paper that Chantal had given us to publish, and we're very grateful for that. I will, in some ways, try to adopt a skeptical role in some of the key arguments that have been outlined there. Let me start with a very brief reading of that paper. I think that the remark that the onslaught of neoliberal authoritarianism has given rise to, after the pandemic, opportunities for the surveillance and monitoring of the population through, as Chantal said, Silicon Valley apps and so on. But at the same time has accentuated, I would say, the trend of the ascendance of the populist right. I think that the point that that Chantal makes, that the left needs a program for the protection of society, as its centerpiece, such as the green democratic transformation, for example, is a very interesting one. As Chantal says, such projects can empower people and engender social justice and solidarity instead of essentially repeating what is happening now, making people retreat in defensive nationalism and a passive acceptance of technological solutions. So I would like, however, to express my wariness in some ways with regard to some of the fundamentals of the proposal, first of all. Essentially, these are questions that I try to pose in an affirmative way to hopefully generate some more discussion. What I'm worried about are the details of the suggested route. The suggestion of a left populist strategy to restore the centrality of democratic values of equality and popular sovereignty is, of course, a very interesting proposal. But my hesitation stems, first of all, from the notion of populism, understood, as I think, as a political strategy that rests on drawing a frontier between the people and the oligarchy, or on the understanding of politics in terms of a binary divide between friend and foe. I will come back to the issue of this effect of binary divides in politics. But I would like, first of all, to probe a little bit more on the way that Chantal Mouffe discusses the left and the problems that exist so far within the left. To give left populism its specificity, I think, Chantal Mouffe herself evokes another binary in some ways by identifying as its alternative a cosmopolitan left, as she mentions in her work, a left that goes against the grain of the popular feeling of precarity, as it has opted for open borders and free trade in some ways. I think that to that, she adds another equivalent element when she argues that this left has shied away from embracing the conflictual character of society, essentially being agonistic. It has shied away from being having an agonistic ethos, striving instead for consensus, as our democracies are towards, I would say, a more deliberative kind of model. Why am I raising this issue? I think that such binary conceptions or visualizations of politics and of course of the left may be counterproductive. And please, I would like to hear from Chantal later, and of course from Paolo, who has also written extensively on this, their response to these thoughts. I would argue that populism, like other forms of political strategies, of course, is a discursive process. I think we are all in agreement to that. The people that populists interpolate do not represent an empirically grounded or objective reality, certainly. They are the product of discursive construction. In the case of populism, as we said, we have a case of binary, antagonistic conceptualization of politics. My hesitation to embrace such constructions rests on my understanding of discursive construction as a complex process that also has destructive aspects, and that's what I'm really a little bit. I would like to probe more this proposal for a populist strategy of the left. Of course, all discourses unavoidably constitute attempts as much to articulate and to stitch together in some ways, but also to suppress narratives, memories, experiences, identities. I think the ones that reproduce binary antagonistic conceptualizations of the us versus them type that the left populist strategy is supposed to do in some ways seem to me to be oversimplifying the political, eliminating nuance and suppressing difference in some ways. I know I put this in a very extreme way, but I am trying to express my concerns and fears with regards to this proposal. Let me be more specific with reference to the left. There's a whole spectrum of political forces and forms of politics that we recognize as left. Some are committed to class politics. Already my co-speakers have talked about them, traditional parties mostly. Some have ventured beyond the confines of these kinds of class-based politics and have either embraced populist agendas of sorts, from the most progressive Podemos, for example, to Germany's Aufstehen, and others that have sprung out of social movements. There is a huge diversity, and this diversity has a long history of successes and unavoidably, of course, mistakes. And within this history, of course, there are the green democratic potentials that Chantal and Paolo have talked about. And most of them have not committed to consensus-oriented politics. So the populist versus non-populist left categorization, to me, and its conflation also with the agonism versus consensus divide that is implied by many left populism advocates, is very problematic for me, because I think that this binary would straitjacket the long experience of left politics, including green politics, and the diverse experiences and memories of agency and resistance that this left has produced. This diversity of forces has reflected different, often conflicting with each other experiences of exploitation, of oppression, of domination, that we cannot really, I think, manage to unify in a way that corresponds to the idea of a populist left subjectivity. But of course, this is in some ways it's a question, it's not an affirmation. I believe that this is a very difficult task and possibly a misleading task for the left at this moment. The binary logic distinguishing a populist left and a more cosmopolitan consensus-prone left in some ways is problematic. As problematic as I would say, as the operationalization of the division between the populist people versus elite construction. Left populism advocates talk about a new popular subjectivity that has the capacity to overcome the fragmentation of the different constituencies that make the left, to redefine different forms of oppression. And of course, I'm coming to protection now, to produce a vision of protection. I would like to stop for a minute to the notion of protection, because as I was reading about it, I felt that the semantics that the evocation of protection mobilize in many ways, come in some ways, conjure a duality between those who need to be protected, the phylakes, as Paolo mentioned, and those that will protect. I think a vision for the left, and I know I'm very idealistic now, and one needs more pragmatic steps towards that, should be to empower those that are supposed to be protected, to give them the possibility to protect themselves. And I see there, I think, what Chantal Mouffe has mentioned, mobilizing people around a democratic, green, progressive kind of deal is possible, in the sense that this can indeed provide people with this kind of inspiration to take over responsibility for their environments, their communities, and so on. But I'm very wary about the utilization of the notion of protection when we discuss left policies and left strategies, especially. I would also argue that what is problematic for me as well is that I cannot see how a binary division of the social and the political can allow, in some ways, the flourishing of the diversity that Chantal Mouffe is talking about within, I would say, the left, the ability to accommodate all these different kinds of experiences that have made the left, from the social movements that revolve around sexuality, around gender issues, around local activism, working class, other class politics, and so on. As I think quite often we've seen with concrete examples that the binarism that populism engenders in some ways, the divides that it engenders, in many ways suppress the diversity within the opposing poles of social conflict. I was thinking Bolivia's recent election results, and I could not avoid thinking in some ways that the absence of Evo Morales from the electoral process in some ways had to do a lot with the return of the electorate to his suggestion, the proposal of a more egalitarian society, because I think Evo Morales represented in some ways the authoritarian elements that a populist discourse engenders in some ways. And I'm worried very much that the populist left is very prone to this kind of suppression of diversity within it and authoritarianism. Let me briefly come to the issue of affect, and I am definitely, I agree with Chantal Mouffe that affect has been neglected by the left, and it needs to be something that any left strategy needs to tap onto. The left politics have for a long time lacked this kind of, I would say, enthusiasm, this kind of drive that would enable people to feel that they are empowered, that they participate, that they're stakeholders. And in that respect, I totally agree with her proposal that affect is something that the left has neglected at its own peril. There's only one note of hesitation here. It's not to undermine the argument, it's just to add an element that Spinoza, who she draws on very rightly so, points out that affect-based knowledge is partial, affect-based ideas are partial, and only a stage in developing a more holistic understanding of situations. I think she herself thinks that affect should be part of constructing a left-wing experience, an experience, sorry, that the left wants to construct among its constituents, but not in the way, of course, that right-wing populists have tried to do. As I have argued elsewhere, the mobilization of affect by right-wing populists has often dissimulated the lack of substantive sovereignty on the part of their constituents, and imitating it on the left is a dangerous practice. But I don't think we disagree with that. I think my final thoughts are very, very simple. I am concerned about what guarantees a left populism has in preserving the long tradition of creating a diverse left that respects diversity and engages critically with it, that has expanded our understanding of rights, political, social, identity, human rights, and so on. And to what extent can we ensure that we don't have a phenomena like, for example, phobic protectionisms of exclusive notions of welfare, like the ones that I think Die Linke or Aufstehen in Germany have experimented with, claiming, and I cannot hold responsible, of course, Chantal Mouffe for that, but claiming that they have been inspired by her work. The left can still have an agonistic ethos, I think, without, in some ways, turning a blind eye to the nuance and critical understanding of the social and the political. And I'm not certain that left-wing populism can achieve that. I also think that...
interrupt you, because we have very, very little time left for questions. And I think a lot of the, we've received a lot of questions that I think will resonate with what you're saying. And so one thing I wanted to say before asking, because I think we'll have maybe one round of answers before we have to wrap up. And I've tried to kind of formulate a question that brings in what you said and what Paolo said, and many of the questions we received from the audience. I wanted to say first that a lot of the questions that we received, we will be taking in consideration in the future for articles and the continuation of this debate on rethinking populism. So it would be great and look at the page every once in a while, because I believe that we will have a lot of answers to these questions. I think one of the things that we've seen from Paolo and Spiros and from the viewers is this question of how to develop practical, like what kind of practical strategies, what are the practical strategies that we can envision or that you suggest that can bring in a project that we could call leftist, green and populist. And that does not, however, undermine this diversity and this importance of the diversity within the leftist poetics that Spiros talked about, but also provides the kind of protection that is needed at the moment that Paolo also spoke about. So how can we design, what practical strategies are there to design such a project that can answer the fears on the side of losing diversity and losing this diversity in the left, but also provide the protection to people in these moments of uncertainty. I would like to maybe start with Chantal's take and then hear from Paolo.
Well, my work is not concerned with practical strategies. I think that basically what I wanted to this is an idea of how we should envisage the left populist strategy today, but in terms of practical things, well, I think that, for instance, it's not at all my interest and my capacity to say, well, these are the kind of measures that we need to. For instance, I think many of those things are already dealt with much better that I could ever have done in a reflection, for instance, about the Green the Green New Deal. You know, there is a lot of work, Petit Fourier, in Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. They are dealing with the kind of strategy, practical strategy. You know, this is not where I can add something. What I am, and this is why I insist, what I propose is to envisage this form of practical measure in terms of a green democratic transformation, to inject, if you want, the idea of the kind of affect that need to be moved. Because my central point, in a sense, of this piece that I am is precisely the role of affect. That is not a question of having so much. Of course, policies and good policies are important, but they are not enough, you know. We've seen, for instance, in what has happened here in Britain, the last election, the Labour Party had fantastic things, but they did not manage, you know, to mobilize people. While on the other side, you had the Johnson get back control. They were able to mobilize affects, you know, and I think that this is what the Labour Party is not. Just, we are going to give you, you know, free broadband, we are going to give you that and that and that, but people, this is not a way in which people felt empowered. They felt empowered by, of course, because it's not necessarily a good way in which you are empowered, but they felt empowered by the idea that we are going to get back control. I think that without, you know, this element of affect, the left is never going to be able to resist the drive towards authoritarianism that is present in right-wing movement. You know, so this is basically what's central in my argument. First, we need to think about protection. So we need to start from where people are. What are their demands? Not just to say this is what they should be thinking. This is no. Where are they? They want protection, but protection can be, you know, envisaged in different ways. There are ways to envisage protection which are going to make people passive, or to mobilize them in, you know, a way which are in fact going to restrict democracy. So my idea was that let's deal with this question of protection, which I think is crucial, but in a way which is going to empower people. So that's one of the the main idea. And of course, the idea that the green democratic transformation could be a way in which many people feel that they can, is a bit of inscription for many demands, and that deal with the question. I think, for instance, that feminists definitively will feel absolutely, you know, in tune with this idea of a green democratic transformation. Many of the social movement, what they want, in a sense, is precisely a type of society in which, well, somebody was making a reference, I think it was Paolo, to notion of care. I mean, this is crucial, you know, and I think that in different ways, of course, different groups are going to find something different in this green democratic transformation. And this is why there is a diversity. It's not a question of putting, you know, everybody on in the same view, but simply a project in which many different groups can recognize themselves. They can inscribe their demand within this. That for me, it was important. And just quickly, because I think I want to answer to the point that Sviros was doing. I mean, obviously, you know, the difference that we have, it might be called a different in is that you start from an associative conception of the political, in which basically politics is about, you know, we should be able always through deliberation to arrive at consensus. I start from a view of politics, which is I call dissociative. This is why politics is about the distinction of an S and a them. And it has got also a long trajectory, you know, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Max Weber, Carl Schmitt, of course, in some senses, it can be authoritarian and right-wing, but it can also be important for the left to recognize that the society is divided. And I think that for me, the main problem with many of the ecological movement today is that they do not recognize that they have an adversary. They believe that let's all discuss and we will, you know, agree. No, there is an adversary. The financial capitalism is an adversary. You are never going to have a real ecological transition if you don't put an end to neoliberalism and financial capitalism. And I think this is important, and this is why a dissociative view is important, you know, and that's a real problem with most of the ecological movement. They believe that, no, it's something everybody should agree on that. No, there is always an us and the them. That's what politics is about. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chantal. Maybe do you have a last comment, Paolo, on this before we wrap up?
All right, very quickly. I think, I mean, I agree with Chantal that, I mean, in defending the basis of the left populist strategy, because ultimately what it was and the way in which it was applied was a call for unity around socioeconomic issues, avoiding the fragmentation that was dominant on the left in order to fight the enemy, right? So it was associating in order to engage in conflict, which is what the right is doing very well. The right has very clear enemies, while the left often looks like it has only idealistic questions to mobilize. And in terms of also sociological, electoral sociology was escaping the ghetto of the urban middle class, which is the most important electoral component for many radical left parties, and instead try to recuperate the popular backing. And I think that this question, this urgency is still very much there, because the left has huge problems in reaching out of metropolitan areas. I mean, this is evident, this is more and more evident. And if the left doesn't have a discourse also for manufacturing workers and for areas that are overly dependent on manufacturing, which are non-urban areas, ex-urban areas in this day and age, the left will continue to lose. I mean, cities will continue to lose, to paraphrase William Galston, because there's no way, whenever the left has focused only on cities, it has governed cities, but it has lost the battle, as it happened also during the Spanish Republic. So the left needs to have a strategy that speaks to constituencies beyond the middle class. This doesn't mean betraying values, that doesn't mean betraying the universalism of rights or respect for diversity, but also we need to refocus on bread and butter issues. We need to refocus on the essentials to understand that in this day and age, there are many people who are really on the breadline, and that the coronavirus crisis is having devastating social consequences for large sections of the working class and the middle class. Therefore, if the left is only telling to people, you need to wear your mask, at some point, the people will turn against the left. And therefore, for example, what Andy Burnham is doing in Manchester, I think is fundamental. Yes, people need to obey the state because it's necessary, but the state needs to protect them. The state needs to give social guarantee, needs to provide wages for people who don't have wage from work, needs to create a new social protection structure. Otherwise, it is completely unrealistic to ask people to undergo such huge sacrifices. And this, in the long run, is going to fuel, once again, the nationalist right.
Thank you, Paolo. Spiros, if you have a final comment before we conclude.
Yes, very, very quickly, I would like to agree with Paolo about, for example, the example that you used about Andy Burnham is very significant. And I think that this is one of the many voices that a left could really muster and mobilize. I don't believe in an overarching discourse that will, in some ways, identify specific kinds of marginalization that would unify the rest of the entire left. And very, very briefly, I would like to say that I think there are other dissociative types of politics that do not necessarily include binary divides of the political. I do not disagree at all with you, Chantal, about the need to have an agonistic kind of politics. I am trying desperately, I must say, I don't have the answers, to see how we can have dissociative kinds of conceptions of politics that, however, do not fall into the trap, in my opinion, I may be wrong, of a binary divide of the political. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Spiros. Thank you, everyone. I leave it to Julian here.
Thank you very much for that discussion. I know that we had so little time to cover so many questions, and we had some wonderful, wonderful questions in the comments coming in all the way through. So as Walid says, we're definitely going to save those, and Spiros and Walid will be looking at them to see whether we can address them in future articles. So do keep an eye on the Rethinking Populism page. Thank you very much to our panelists. If you've enjoyed this debate, we have one every week, you'll be pleased to hear. Next week's will be from the United States, looking at where our editor-in-chief will be, and other reporters will be on the ground looking at what's going on there. So you can follow up with details there with the link I've just put in the chat. We also have a weekly newsletter. If you want to find out highlights of what's been going on in open democracy, please do sign up with the link that I'm about to put there as well. Oh yes, I'll just check that I told you it was going to be a bit shambolic. I just put the wrong link in the wrong place. So here's the live discussions one again. Lastly, as you know, we all need to pay the rent. We rely on contributions and donations. If you'd like to see more public interest journalism like this, please support us. You can do that by visiting our website and going to support.opendemocracy.donate. Just putting that link there for you if you're interested. Thank you all very much again. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you for coming, and I hope we'll be seeing you again soon. Thank you.